Well, good evening. We'd like to call our Wednesday, October 7th special meeting to order. Thank you for joining us, those who are joining us virtually by Zoom. And we have a few council members who are en route or will not be able to attend tonight. So at this time, as we call the meeting to order, we'll look to item 2.0 is the invocation. Any volunteers for that? Nobody lean on our pastors? All right.
Yeah.
Reverend Pastor Wright, Bishop.
Thank you, Mayor. Let us bow our heads. Father, we thank you for this special meeting. We thank you, God, for the purpose. We thank you for your love and kindness. Lead us and guide us, direct us here tonight. For our efforts and our desires is that the city be one. And God, that all our residents be safe, our police officers are safe, and God, that we could be that great city with relationships between police officers and citizens second to none. Help us as a council to make the right decisions, God, to take this city forward, that this city may be a destination growing economically, that all could prosper. And we thank you in Jesus' name. Amen.
Man, thank you, Councilmember Wright. If we could all stand for the Pledge of Allegiance. Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. All right, council, as we work to approve the agenda, just a few housekeeping rules for tonight. We will operate under the best practices of Robert's rules. Please press your lights to be acknowledged. Tonight, we will have Dr. Robert Friedmann and his deputy to present some very insightful information to us under the topics of community policing. We would ask that we allow Dr. Friedmann to give his presentation in full, and then we'll do 2 rounds of questioning, or if we have any questions at the conclusion. So with that, we'll look for a motion to approve the agenda.
So be it, Mr. Mayor.
All right, there's a motion by Councilmember Wright to approve. Is there a second?
I'll second.
All right, second by Mayor Pro Tem Jensen. Any discussion? Yeah, I'll come back there. Any discussion on the motion?
She wanted to second.
Oh, is that, I thought he had a comment. Okay. All right. Any discussion on the motion? And Madam Clerk, for the record, that's is a motion by Councilmember Wright, it's a second by Councilmember Ingram. Okay, all right, any discussion on the motion? All right, Council, I'll look to you for your votes. All right, Madam Clerk, that motion carries 6-0. Those present. All right, at this time, we'll go to item 4.1, turn it over to Chief Hawkins.
Thank you, Mayor. First of all, thank you for allowing me to do this introduction. This, just for a little bit of history, came out of the external committee who was looking at the topic of community policing, and specifically Councilwoman Ingram did a little bit of research and found what she believed is the expert, and I believe as well is the expert from the International Association of Chiefs of Police, the chairman on community policing. I'm going to read the bio just really quickly so you know who is about to present and share a little bit. Dr. Robert Friedmann he's a founding director of the award-winning Georgia International Law Enforcement Exchange and professor emeritus of criminal justice at Georgia State University. He is a distinguished chair of the safety partnerships. He was a distinguished chair of the public safety partnerships from 2007 to 2010. He served as a chair from 1989, 2002 of the Criminal Justice Department at Georgia State University. He received his BS, Bachelor of Science degree in sociology from the University of Haifa in Israel, his master's and PhD from the University of Minnesota, and his MSSW in social work from the University of Wisconsin. Dr. Friedmann has always been interested in community policing and studied it, as well as terrorism and crime analysis. He's written a book entitled Community Policing, Perspectives and Prospects in 1992. I've attached his biography for you all to review. We don't have the time to tell all his accolades and all his awards. Let me narrow it down a little bit though. Dr. Friedmann actually is renowned internationally, not just because of as the professor he is, but leading its department, but he also assisted in the security plan in preparation for the Olympics in 1996 in Atlanta, in 2002 in Salt Lake City, in Athens, Greece in 2004, London in 2012, Rio in 2016, and for the G8 summit at Sea Island in Georgia in 2004. He actually served on the Olympic Park Bombing Blue Ribbon Commission and a number of other commissions as well. Dr. Friedmann actually, when I got my undergraduate degree from Georgia State University, so he was actually big time when I went through. So to be able to sit on a committee with him is an honor. To actually know and study from him is an honor as well. So without further ado, it's Dr. Friedmann.
Dr. Friedmann, welcome, sir.
Good evening. Thank you very much. I appreciate the kind introduction. I appreciate the invitation, and Mayor and honorable council members. Thank you for inviting me to speak about community policing. It is exhilarating to see a former student and the chief doing well, and I'm very proud of Chief Hawkins and her achievements in Fayetteville. The only addition to the bio, and I'm glad that she read the short version, is that I have been dealing with the concept of community policing since the early 1980s. So it has been close, near and dear to me, and perhaps like choosing a child's name, if you can live with it for a week or a month, then you stick with that name. So I've stuck with the issue of community policing for a very long time, and I'm very proud to have had the opportunity to do research on it and to promote the concept. Without any further ado, what I'd like to do, with your permission, is to get into a brief introduction of community policing, and then get a little bit more in depth into it So if I may ask for your patience and indulgence while I'll go through it, I want to do it as systematically and comprehensively as possible, so that by the time that I finish, and hopefully within 40 minutes or so, maybe 45, I'd like to leave time for any questions that you may have. So with that, allow me to share the screen. I assume you can see it. So I'm titling it Community Policing More Than Ever Before. And it is part of enhancing public safety. And in a sense, it is exactly what Councilmember Wright said in his invocation. Be one, and he can quote the rest of it better than I can, but that sort of stuck with me. So be one community, and that's a challenge that is much easier stated than done. I want to start perhaps with one of my favorite definitions of policing before I get into community policing, and that is one that was developed back in the late 70s by John Alderson from England, who said that policing is about the guaranteeing of the freedom of movement of people and merchandise. This is exactly what policing and democracy is all about. You want to allow people freedom of movement and of merchandise. That's commerce, that's the economic base. So if you have crimes against people, if you have crimes against property, that's what minimizes or hampers that freedom. Let me start with a very brief history of policing, just to put things in some context. There are 4 key policing phases. One is the political phase from 1840 to 1930s, then the reform phase for another 40 years to the 70s, then the community-oriented phase from the 70s and on, and then community policing came in literally the mid-1980s. So each of these phases has several characteristics that are important to understand and get into context. The first phase of policing, and this is immediately to dispel all those who say that we have always been doing community policing, that is simply absolutely not the case. It was typified by close ties between the police and politicians, not between the police and the community. The police was closely dependent on elected officials, both demographically and ethnically. So when elected leaders changed, usually the entire police force changed, not only the police chief, but the entire police force. So in Chicago, when you had an Italian police chief, most of the officers were Italians, or if a Polish chief took over, then most of the officers were Polish. And clearly that nepotistic relationship, if you will, resulted in corruption, and it hindered equitable police performance. So as a reaction to that, then the reform movement, the 40 years of 1930 to 1970, basically wanted to do the following. It wanted to cope with police corruption, and it wanted to have professional crime fighting. And if you recall the Untouchables, and that's basically how the FBI came into being. And then it was reactive in nature. But it was really about minimizing corruption. But because of that, it distanced itself from the community. And then the next phase, whoops, how did I get there? I'm sorry. I want to put this, no, this is correct. I want to put some crime statistics into place just to give you a sense of the crime figures. So if you look at violent crimes that are comprised of murder, rape, robbery, and aggravated assault. So these are crimes against the person and crimes against property, but also against person. If you look at the 1960s, so in 1960, it was just under 200 cases of violent crimes per 100,000 in the population. If you look at the middle of the chart in 1991, exactly 30 years later, it peaked into almost 800 cases per 100,000. And this chart from the Congressional Research Service based on FBI statistics ended in 2016. So I got the stats from 17, 18, and 19. And as you can see, it is about 382, 368, and 366. So it shows a little slight decline. But what's very important is look at this figure. From 1960 to 1991, there was a 400% increase in violent crime. From 1991 to 2019, there's a 50% reduction in violent crime, but it is 100% higher than the level in the 60s. Now, you say this is about the nation, so I went and tried to find the figures for Fayetteville. And what's interesting is that if you look at that line that is the national line, Fayetteville actually was 125% higher in 1991 than the US peak. And in 2016, it was still 200% higher than the US low. So there's still a lot of work to do. But the reason that I picked up violent crime is because these are usually the most reliable statistics, particularly when you're talking about homicide, less so when you talk about rape, robbery, and aggravated assault. But these are also the crimes that bother the population most. If you want me to put it in one sentence, people would prefer, if they have a choice, to be conned out of $12 than be hit over the head for it. So the community-oriented phase started from 1970 and on. So it was, if reactive policing was a revolving door for criminals, then police reform, which we will call PP for this case, was a response to the closeness to the community. But if it resulted in distancing police from the community, then community policing was a response to the development of the policing movement, which is the police professionalism. What community policing actually tried to do is minimize crime production. And please pay attention to the notion of crime production, because that's a key concept in the definition of community policing. So the underlying approach is, first of all, to understanding crime not merely as a legal concept, but to understand it as a behavioral concept. And let me explain this. A legal concept is that crime is illegal. If you don't want any crime, let's abolish the law books, and then there's no crime whatsoever. But there's still behavior that the community feels that is hurting it. And that's why it's important to understand crime as a behavioral concept, namely, why do people commit crime and what affects it? So this behooves us to look at the community as crime producer. Look back at the statistics on Fayetteville that I showed you just a minute ago. I think that you will agree with me that it is not the police that creating those statistics. It is the community that is creating it. So if we look at the community as the producer of crime, then we also look at the community as the controller of crime. Okay. So to illustrate this, let's take a look for a second at doctors and at police officers. Doctors provide medical service. Okay. Doctors do not cause an illness, and the epidemiology of a disease is dealt with at the community level. The two best examples I can give you is cardiovascular diseases could end up in a heart attack. It's dealt with at the ER, but cardiovascular diseases are not dealt at the ER. By the same token, if you look at police, they provide police service. They do not cause crime. And I don't want to be cynical and say that some police do. That's not what we're about here. But the epidemiology needs to be dealt at the community level. So let's look at this epidemiology issue, because what we want to do based on what we now know about COVID-19 is that we have the epidemiology, and then we have the number of incidents that end up for hospitals at the ER. So if we want to have less incidents at the ER, we want to minimize the epidemiology of the disease in the community. Yeah? So let's talk a little bit about the background of community policing. In the 80s, community policing became a buzzword for law enforcement, and everybody saw it in different ways, and it meant different things to law enforcement. So some people did the national night out, some people did the midnight basketball, some departments did the, you know, school policing and bike rides and so on and so forth. So community policing for many years has been, and to some extent is still, a very elusive concept. But until 1992, there was not even a definition of community policing. If you recall, President Clinton in 1994 committed 100,000 police officers. Okay. And then in 2001, with the disaster of September 11, the advent of community policing, the advent of Homeland Security basically relegated community policing to the wayside. And this is what became the fashionable thing to spend money on. You'll be happy to know that community policing doesn't require that much money. So there were two sets of working assumptions, if you want to call them the 10 Commandments, and they were offered by two. One is our acquaintance, John Alderson, in his book on policing freedom in 1979 and in his article in 1982. And then Trojanowitz and Buckaroo, he was a police chief, she was an academic in 1990. These were basically guidelines that said, this is what we need to do in order to have community policing, but it doesn't really define what community policing is. So in 1992, I wrote the first definition of community policing in the literature, and it's important to pay attention to the components because it's very different than what people think about community policing. So first of all, it is a philosophy and a strategy that is aimed at achieving more effective and efficient crime control, reduce fear of crime. We don't deal only with the crime itself, but also with how people fear it, because it affects the quality of life of people. How to improve the quality of life, indeed. How to improve police services and police legitimacy. It is always an important element. And how to do so through a proactive reliance on community resources. And this is probably the key part of the center of the definition that seeks to change crime-causing conditions. And this assumes a greater need for accountability of police, along with greater public share in decision-making and a greater concern for civil rights and liberties. Now, mind you, I wrote this in 1992, well before any of the current demands for police reform has hit the national scene. In 2019, the International Association of Chiefs of Police adopted a resolution with this definition. And I'm not going to read the definition again, but I'll just show you in highlighted yellows, what did they add or change? So you can see that it says it's a comprehensive philosophy. I decided not to argue because philosophy is comprehensive. It's not partial anyway. And it guides policy. I accept that. But it's also important that they added that it assumes greater accountability of elected community leaders and the community in general. And also, you want to do it through the identification of service needs and priorities. And that is a key issue for any public policy and any planning. I'm very proud and happy to say that the IACP is taking this not only as a resolution, but as implementation of police functioning, not only around the country, but around the world. This association represents 162 countries with 33,000 police chiefs from literally all over the world. So the principles of community policing are as follows. First of all, it's comprehensive. It's based on partnership buildings. It is proactive. You do not wait until something happens in order to act. And it is in addition to, not instead of reactive policing. You still need the immediate response to a 911 call. And it's focusing on crime causation. So what we have is a shift in community policing from being a police-centered society into a service-centered society. It sounds simple when we say it, but when you see the next one, you'll see that it's not as simple as it looks. So what I mean by service-centered is that if you have somebody in the center of that service, everybody in the periphery provides that service. So I'm moving the police to the periphery alongside parks and recreation, housing, volunteers, job training, infrastructure, water, electricity, and so on, roads, the private sector, which is an important partner, education, and health. And all of that constitutes a service-centered community. To me, if you're talking about police reform, it needs to focus on reforming the entire gamut of services to the community, not just that of the police. That puts the citizen in the community in the center of the focus, and I think that that makes much more sense to me when we deal with public policy. So the suggested reform for police is, first of all, in terms of standard operating procedures, the training. What is the meaning of service? Why do police officers become police officers? For a very long time, and still, they don't do it because of the money, because there's not that much money in policing. But they do it because there's a calling. But for different officers, there's different kind of calls, because some, all they are excited about is the 2 a.m. chase or high-speed chase. That's not the kind of officer that you want. Well, you may need some. Most of the officers need to know how to resolve issues, not how to escalate them. Very important to influence police culture. What happened in Minneapolis is affected and was affected by a police culture that condoned that kind of behavior, because the other 3 officers stood by the wayside without intervening and without stopping that behavior. Okay? And organizational changes, which I'll talk about. And then the second issue, which I alluded to earlier, this is a comprehensive change. It includes agencies, not only the police. I'll give you one example just for starters. If you have a rape case, if the police officer doesn't collect the information that is needed for criminal prosecution, the justice system will lose a case. But if during that process, he will or she will double victimize the already distressed victim, then that's not the way to collect evidence. On the other hand, if the evidence is not collected in a way that is feasible from a medical perspective, then that information is going to be either useless or at best not helpful. Therefore, it's very important to have an interaction between the health profession and the police profession. That's true about social workers, it's true about educators, school policing, and so on and so forth. So I'll go very briefly on organizational changes, and there are 3. First of all, internal police changes. Second, inter-agency changes. And 3, mapping the community and taking into inventory. So let's look at the internal organizational aspects within the police. I'll run through these very quickly because I can spend an hour on each one of those. There's no time to do that. Very important to have human resource development, because the best assets that you have, and 95% of your budget goes to police salaries, you have to have the best human resources on the force. Okay? How do you recruit them? How do you train them? How you perform evaluations on their performance? You know, keep in mind that the police provides a service. The crime statistics are a byproduct of the information that they get, but it's not the product that they produce. Okay? What kind of a reward structure you have for police performance? Okay? How do you deploy personnel? What is your organizational structure and how and their deployment. What kind of authority do officers have in the field? Do you have to send a supervisor for an arrest, or do you trust your officers to do what they need to do when they are out in the field? Equitable enforcement is a very important issue. And then workload and control on information system. For example, how is communication done? How is communication shared when a shift changes from one shift to another shift? How is supervision done? And how much discretion do police officers have? Because the less discretion they have, the less they can perform the duties as community policing officers. On the other hand, if they have too much discretion, that could hamper equitable discharge of the role. So it's a very, very demanding element. And lastly, on this issue, it's the extent of community policing. There are a lot of police departments that say that they have a crime prevention unit, or they have a community policing unit, or they have a community policing officer. Every officer, from the patrol officer to the chief, needs to be doing community policing. Otherwise, the department is not doing community policing. How you investigate, how you come and respond to a call, this is all, how you send a letter, how you call somebody, all of this is part of the community policing effort. The second issue is the relationship between the police and other agencies. So there are law enforcement agencies and there are non-law enforcement agencies. And the police interacts, your department interacts with all of them. Each one of those organizations have their own organizational needs. They have their own budgets, and they basically work in some sort of silos, which I'll talk about in a minute. They have their own budget, they have their own personnel, they have their own technology. And if you think that police departments don't speak to each other very well and they don't communicate very well, these days, perhaps a little better than before, then police agencies and other agencies don't communicate well at all. Organizations are usually resistant to innovation. I'm in a university. I can tell you that universities are probably the most conservative entities that I'm familiar with, and I'm familiar with a lot of entities. I'm happy to say that actually police agencies are the most liberal agencies in government anywhere. And it's true not only for the United States, it's true for most democratic countries, because police know how to go with the flow. Other agencies are more reluctant to do that. That doesn't mean that there are not chiefs who are conservative and there are not officers who are conservative, but as an organization, police can handle change much better than other agencies. Very important to have support from the public. The police is probably one of the social services that receives the least support of the public, and this is under normal circumstances. I'm not talking about what's happening today. Very important to have partnerships with businesses and DIDs, or downtown improvement districts. There are quite a number of police agencies that have MAPs, or mutual aid pacts, to help them police. In the past, some of those pacts worked well for some purposes, but sometimes they also served for quotas of writing tickets or making arrests. When one agency didn't have enough of a quota, they went to another sister agency and said, can we go ahead and write some tickets because we need to fulfill a quota. We really need to move away from that, and that's a sore point in a lot of police departments, and it's something to reckon with. Cooperation is basically relying on goodwill. I can give you probably one of the best examples. In preparation for the Olympics, there were about 400 law enforcement agencies that were represented in the planning efforts, and try and handle any committee meeting with 400 people, that's simply impossible. And there, of course, were ego fights and other kinds of fights, and eventually they figured out how to work in operational committees And until today, that legacy actually made a difference for the city of Atlanta and the metropolitan area, but it is still based on goodwill. You can have mutual aid pacts, but there's nothing like goodwill and relying on that to do what you need to do. How is coordination routinized? That's another important element. And finally, how do you market your police to potential supporters? And again, police are probably more in need for support and advocacy than any other social service that I'm familiar with. And the last component is mapping the community and taking inventory. So first of all, crime. I'd like to impose on you that crime statistics are the property of the police, but that's because they collect and investigate and store those statistics. May not be a bad idea for the Department of Health to, for example, publicize and have a press conference on crime statistics and get it out of the hands of the police, because if the police don't produce the crime, why should the police be responsible for the extent of crime in the community? And if the police is responsible, go back to that circle that I showed earlier, then all other agencies ought to have responsibility for that, not just the police. So is the community. For example, I've done a lot of community policing training, and when you talk to police officers and ask them to describe the beat, they are very good at describing all the physical aspects. But when you ask them to go ahead and describe the percentage of elderly who need care, who are alone, or the percentage of teenage pregnancies or school dropouts or in and out migration, these are pieces of information that are available, but police don't know it and don't use it in order to design the intervention in the community. That's very important. Talking about intervention, I'm ahead of myself. How to coordinate activities between various government entities and business. There is an element of formal institutions of which the police and school and so on are one, but we often tend to ignore the informal elements in the community, and they have a great role in having an impact on crime. The church, okay, the family. We have turned schools into babysitters for kids instead of having the family take a role, and that is true across the board, not just to one ethnic or racial group. It's by and large, parents are expecting teachers to educate their kids, but values are not always part of what school is teaching. That needs to be taught in the community. I don't know, when was the last sermon, Councilman Wright may know it better than I, when was the last sermon on the 10 Commandments? Thou shalt not murder, which is, by the way, the 6th commandment. It doesn't say thou shalt not kill. But by the way, if you'll allow me just a moment of biblical wisdom, policing is not a new concept, and it is actually as old as Deuteronomy 16:18. Judges and officers shall thou place in thine gates. And if you want more than that, we can have another discussion, but I really like that. So
Ahead and preach.
I can do that. All right, so community policing is, first of all, is decentralized command structure, because if you, and it's easier to say it than do it, because police by nature are hierarchical organizations. Okay? You need to have information that flows laterally, not only from top to bottom or reporting back from bottom to top. Okay, citizens need to play a key role. They're still not playing enough of a role. And by the way, this sounds easy. Not a lot of citizens want to do it. And sometimes the citizens who want to do it may take control into directions that may not be beneficial for a city or community. These principles are adaptable to any location, and they emphasize empowerment. because without that, it simply remains a slogan. Very important to have relationship building, okay? This is not about police-community relations, it's about community policing, and the difference is tremendous because relations are typically cosmetic, community policing is substantive, but you still need to build relationship as part of that. And it has to be locally initiated. You cannot have somebody who's coming from out of town, whether it's the governor or a president, who will tell you what you need to do in your community. It has to come internally because that has the most promise for success at the end. Okay. And then the last piece here is that it needs to focus on crime causing condition. I often say that policing is a misunderstood profession. It's misunderstood by those who receive the services, and it's misunderstood by those who deliver the services. And this is one of the reasons, because if police chiefs take the credit when crime goes down, they need to take the blame when crime goes up. And the fact of the matter is that it is a very limited credit or blame that they need to take, because if they don't produce the crime, they shouldn't take the blame for it. Now, that doesn't mean that they don't have responsibility in the community, but I think that for many years, we're simply missing the boat by attributing these expectations to police departments that are simply unrealistic. So here are some recommendations, and I have one more slide and we'll finish it, and just about the time that I was planning on. So first of all, move to a service center model. Move away from these silos that each of these agencies are separate. You hear a lot now is the defunding of police. Let's redirect it to social services. Well, with all due respect, I'm not against redirecting, but if you do it, you need to do it with a policy formulation that makes sense, that you know what the problem is, you know how to go about it, and then you know how to measure it if it is indeed successful. But the issue of silos is important, because if you take a social worker at 2 a.m. to deal with somebody who is either mentally disturbed or high on PCP, a social worker is not qualified to deal with that, particularly if violence is involved. So you need a qualified police officer who knows how to deal with it, and hopefully knows how to deal with it well, okay? We need to implement an overall approach, okay? Not just putting everything on the shoulders of police. That's simply, it's not fair to the police, it's not fair to the community, and it absolves the other entities from being real partners in fighting crime. So I also suggest not only do not penalize police, but on penalizing police, if you want to defund police, do it because you have a robust policy that you want to move forward, not because you want to penalize the police. Because what you've seen in Minneapolis happens in every profession. It happens in banks, it happens in universities, it happens in research labs, it happens in factories, it happens in government, it happens in street crimes, it happens in violent crimes, it happens in international relationships, it happens in stock market, Ponzi scheme, and the list is big. You have never heard a demand that when a medical personnel kills a patient, and I'm not talking about malpractice, I'm talking about a murder, to shut down hospitals. And that's what penalizing the police is all about. You need to prosecute the one who did it, you need to change culture, you need to do all the other things that can improve and should improve police services, but penalizing police, that is the wrong public policy. Actually, I will take this opportunity and say, you need to raise the salaries of your police officers if you want police officers to do what they're doing and the risk that they're having. So the funding should be approach-driven, and the approach should have a cogent strategy, not slogans. And it's important to be in the driver's seat. Don't wait for somebody else to do it. I think you have a great driver in your chief. I think that I'm impressed that the mere fact that you have asked for a briefing on community policing say that you really care about this. And I commend you for doing that, because I will tell you, after the events in Minneapolis and in Atlanta, where we had social protests and violence, a lot of people started talking about community policing. Nobody really knew what they were talking about. I'll say this with a certain amount of pain, not with any disdain. They really are not looking at community policing more than a public relations stunt. And as you can see, it's much more complicated than that. So here are a few force multiplier suggestions. Partner with your visitors to the city and use reverse 911. Partner with employees. They could be your eyes and ears. Partner with community leaders, formal and informal ones. Know what their concerns are. Let them know what your concerns are. Partner with civic groups. What is on their agenda? Okay, and partner with other government agencies, and then identify sources of excellence. For example, the IACP has given community policing awards for the last 20 years. Those are examples of best practices, and there are, let's say, 5 times 20, it's about 100 plus a few more. There are well over 100 communities that were recognized as best practices in community policing, okay? And then when you identify those, there's a lot to learn. No need to always reinvent the wheel. So I'll sum it up and then I'll open it up for Q&A. So community policing is about understanding crime causation, because if you have the wrong diagnosis and you don't know why crime is taking place in the first place, then you provide the wrong prognosis and you do the wrong intervention and you probably waste the wrong resources, okay? So community policing is about proactive intervention, and it is not a substitute to reactive policing. It's in addition to it. It needs to be practiced department-wide, and it needs to be community-centered, not police-centered. Community policing is about partnership with the community, and I'm talking about genuine partnership. And again, this is not easy, okay? It's important to have partnership with other communities, with other social services. In other words, open the silos up. It's important to have it with civic associations, with advocacy groups, with the private sector. And last but not least, it is not about a quick fix solution, which means that there are several challenges. If a police chief comes in and they want to sort of change the rules of the game because they want to make a difference, it depends how long that chief is going to be in place, because everybody wants a quick fix. You have to be patient. If I said that about the police chief, I'll say it about elected officials. Mayors, city council members usually want to have quick solutions. This is not a quick solution. I usually do not like to use the term, it is the only solution, but I will say it in a politically correct sense. I am not aware of a better one. Short of that, I would strongly urge you to embark on genuine community policing, because as I think it was either in the invocation or in the movie that led to it, you want to be a model for the United States, and you have the opportunity to do so. So with that, I thank you, and I will open it up for questions.
Thank you, Dr. Friedmann. Great presentation. Did have a light or two. I guess, so just so I understand it, and then I'll probably have some of this directed to the chief. When you said that it should be an overall understanding of the causations of crime. I know you're a sociologist. I've got some degree in that, but what I wanted to know, are you talking about the obvious things like poverty and the things that those things cause, or what type of comprehensive diagnosis of crime, as you showed our chart over the years systematically? I know you haven't analyzed our community, but explain that concept to me a little bit about what you meant by that.
Okay, first of all, it's an excellent question. Okay, second, to respond to it, there is not a single cause of crime. In each community, it's different, and it depends what kind of crime you're talking about. If you're talking about street crime, there's one set of causes. If you're talking about, and I'll mention a few. If you're talking about white collar crime, there's another set of causes. So for example, if you're poor and you steal, you're a thief. But if you're rich and you steal, you're either a kleptomaniac or somebody that has a Ponzi scheme. So I'd rather not look at a specific individual. That will be in the court documents, that will be in the investigative files. I'm interested in the macro level understanding of what is associated with the level of crime that is produced in a given community. So for example, if you look at physical issues, typically blighted communities produce a higher level of crime than gentrified communities. And I'm not saying that they do it because of the blight, because I think it's unfair to say that poor people commit more crime than non-poor people. That is simply not the case. I think it's very important to understand that. But what I would recommend that if you adopt the approach of understanding crime causation, you have universities, you have researchers that you can invite into Fayetteville who can look at associational and causal relationships in the community that could pinpoint what is associated with a higher or lower crime rate and what kind of crimes we're talking about. In this particular case, clearly you have to worry about the level of violent crimes compared to other cities in North Carolina and other cities across the United States. So I'm not trying to cut away from the response, but I think the key here is to understand what causes crime condition. There's many more factors than a single one, so I'm not about to point one out, but the mere thinking of let's look at what causes crime in the community is what will make a difference for your community.
Thank you. And the second half of that question is to Chief. As he laid out, kind of the framework for community policing and the different key points with interaction with other agencies, mapping the community, coordination, operating in silos. I know you've only been here a few years, and you have probably been here just long enough to understand what's going on, but not quite long enough to fix everything. How would you say we compare with what we have with the framework that he described?
First of all, of course, I see the same presentation you see, and it's kind of cool to watch and understand and continue to learn as what we do. We always want to learn and say, how can we get better, and look at some framework. So with all those concepts, because this is not new, what we strive always, there's not one answer, like you said, to say that's a key problem. What we think about when we have our ComStat meeting, when we have our discussions and we talk about different things, it's horrible to see the issues like a drive-by shooting or the issues where youth are having guns. So when we look at that in our meetings and we start talking about it, that's how things get implemented, like our educating kids on gun violence. That's how Operation Ceasefire gets put in place, because then we have look for opportunities, not just to be reactionary and answer the call to investigate the crime, but to also educate and empower the community to understand there's other options. Are they aware? Do we have this opportunity to build this relationship and give them another avenue, another thought process? So absolutely, we have a lot of things that we have implemented in the city, and it didn't just start from me, that were already existing. But as we think continuously, we're always thinking of what else can we do to address the problem when we have our opportunities to be in the public, or what we look at, what communities we're going to go into when we do a partnership, what communities we're going to do our movie night. We look for the communities. One of the criteria we let's look at the schools that don't have as many opportunities based off of their area. Are the police responding in those areas often? Let's go to community. Are the kids exposed to law enforcement because of reactionary? Let's give them another opportunity to get engaged with police. So we're always thinking about those opportunities as they come about. We will always continue to try to get better. but most of our programs, events, our relationship building opportunities is to expand every aspect of relationship from private to the public to the schools. So I think I believe as watching it, can we get better? Absolutely. I feel that department wide, watching on Facebook, seeing somebody walking downtown, two officers getting engaged with someone, doing their own thing, not being directed by me to do it. That's how you show success of when everyone's stretched out, doing their thing, building relationships one-on-one, how we become a force multiplier to be able to have a conversation. So I'm going to be biased and say we do well.
Okay, all right. Well, I guess I'm kind of trying to drill down into something specific. So the recommendation to work with informal institutions,
Yeah.
social service,
Yep.
civic organizations, community organizations, faith-based. I know you do coffee with the preachers. What's our relationship like with social service, for instance?
So it's more than just coffee with the pastors. It is a faith forum where we do two things. We train them because we know they reach a lot of different individuals with their congregations or with their leadership on topics they want to know about, prevention and things like that. But we also listen to them. We definitely have other relationships in regards to social services. We're always available. What was that second part besides that? But
Yeah, it was social services.
Okay.
It was other civic organizations, so forth. It was in his presentation.
yeah, so I know you have a lot of the list that we have who we've got engaged with, whether it be through our Operation Ceasefire for probation and parole, whether it's besides the of course the sheriff department, besides the schools where we're in the Cumberland County schools, being available to private entities and public entities, establishing this, being a part of the National Faith in Blue, what's going on, inviting ideas to say, hey, how can we have a conversation with the new leaders we just met in this last 6 months, as well as the ones who still historically who have been here, to get in the table a conversation of what the topic's going to be is about community policing, which is what's your perspective. So understanding everyone does play this role in looking at when we make our relationships. Another intro is other departments within the city, talking to code enforcement, building those relationships. And when they go out, is there an opportunity that we can help them address other issues? Parks and Recs, thinking of other ways we can do some type of beautification. One, does it help the city? Of course it helps the city. Does it help the neighborhood? Of course it helps the neighborhood. If they get pride in saying there's a connection. This weekend, part of the Faith in Blue is we're going to do some type of cleanup with some members of community watch groups, but it's their role. And then we get that relationship building. So definitely believe there's other opportunities, but we need the other social networks to understand you're part of the community and helping us. And you're empowered to have this conversation together to say, how do we address this issue?
Gotcha. Thank you. Councilwoman Ingram?
Mayor Colvin, I have 5 questions. Do you want me to hold to the end?
This
or-
is the end. No, go ahead. Let him
okay,
rip.
I didn't know. Okay. So I will start with, can you explain to me, and I think Chief Hawkins just pretty much detailed it, the service-centered model. Chief Hawkins, is that pretty much what you described right there? Yes. Okay. Thank you. And then Mayor Colvin asked about the overall approach. Can you explain to me reverse 911? I think I understand it, but can you explain to me reverse 911? Either or.
That is reverse 911 is when we push out information through our 911 call, like whether it be almost like the alert that you may get from a tragic event. Hey, information, be alert. I believe Dr. Friedmann was saying that we can push it out and asking for in a survey process. Correct, Dr. Friedmann? Is that what you're saying?
That's one way. The other way is simply say, if you know that maybe there's a pedophile in the neighborhood and you want to share that information with people in the neighborhood, you can do a reverse 911
Yoko.
and push that information out.
Okay, thank you. And then my next question is, earlier you were talking about Minneapolis, and you said, and I just want clarity, you said it happens everywhere and it happens in other institutions. And we are in the climate that we are in because of police, and we seeing it happen publicly when it comes down to police. And so I just wanted to make sure that you are not justifying what happened with
No,
in Minneapolis,
no.
but you were just saying this happens across other agencies.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. No,
Okay.
Look, I'm still, this was May 25th, and I have never seen murder in daylight in front of my eyes. And that's what it was. I was, and I'm still shocked. So no, the last thing that I will do is condone that behavior. That's not what I meant. What I meant is that between that and asking to defund the police because you want to penalize police, there's a distance. And I gave examples that you have violations, egregious violations in any other social institution, economic institution, business, factories, and so on, but it's not accompanied with a demand to shut down, say, hospitals or banks. And by the way, white collar crime oftentimes is quite deadly. I'll give you an example of the Union Carbide plant in India, in Bhopal, that had a chlorine leak that killed 3,000 people. That's a white collar crime, yet it's a very serious issue, okay? But what's important to understand is the need to deal with the case so that it doesn't happen again, but penalizing the police is not the answer.
Thank you. And then my follow-up to that before I get to my last question is, I watched a interview of African-American comedian Dick Gregory, and it was a while ago, but he was talking about how he brought up something you mentioned about how as we always look to penalize police officers versus giving them something to lose. Kind of giving them, I guess what incentives, like you said, salary, giving them a decent salary that make them care more about their job. But I feel if you are a police officer, of course you got in this because you care about your community. But I was gonna say that's something that I had heard somewhere else. And so thank you for bringing that up. My final question is, when it comes down to causations, as you called it. So last night, one of my communities had a serious shootout. And when we look at causations and we go into the details of, and I know it's case by case, and we start to think about, okay, what is causing individuals to do these certain things? And I know Chief Hawkins is presenting us a new program, and I hear a lot about getting to youth while they're young, so they're not getting into any other trouble, right? But when we look at some of the crimes, well, I'm going to speak for my district. When I look at crimes that happen in my district that I hear about the most, they're adults and they're probably my age or a little bit older. And so how can we combat that? So like I know of a program where they hire, or there's a grant that allows people to organizations, law enforcement organizations, to partner with past gang members and give them a stipend who are coming back into the community and help them pull current gang members out of that lifestyle.
Yes, New York is a good example of that.
Say that again.
New York did
New
that.
York. Okay, so you're familiar with what I'm talking about.
Yes.
And so when I'm hearing mostly about youth and young adults, Chief, how can Chief or Mr. Dr. Friedmann, how can we look at other generational demographics, because they're necessarily really what's causing the crime? And I know we want to keep our youth, so definitely keep that going, but really get into them with those genuine relationships, right? And saying, and I know sometimes in other agencies, they kind of befriend them, but you don't know I'm a police officer, but that's not genuine to me. And so I just want to know, like, how do we move that effort forward?
Yeah, I think how I interpret your question as well as the presentation, it kind of falls in the internal external committee that's established, right? You all are doing something huge, which is asking questions, trying to make an understanding. You're listening and learning. What the peripheral that I understand is, it's not a police question. It is a true community question. It is a true relational. Why is this happening? And the community has to have that input and take that ownership of saying, I can see it's happening. I know who did this. Now let's talk. They don't want to hear from me to tell them it's wrong. They know it's wrong. They need to hear it and take ownership of that. And when we talk about, it's not a silo, it's a true, honest evaluation of, what do you need for it to stop? That's all. What do we need? You're not angry at me. Who are you angry at? And let's resolve those issues. And is there something missing that we can help you get to? But the first one is the ownership of, yeah, I'm mad. This is all relational. It's not strangers doing a drive-by shooting. This is relational. So that's how I interpret it. And I'll let Dr. Friedman.
I fully agree with the chief, and I'll give you an example. A few years ago, there was a case in Atlanta in the 6 o'clock news. There was a young guy sobbing that, somebody killed his mom, and it was horrible, and tears were rolling down his cheek. Long story short, he killed her because she didn't give him pocket money. The guy was 34 years old. So when I'm talking about crime causation, I don't know that not giving him pocket money is what caused him to kill her. What is important is that he had a set of options for behavior, and he chose the one that is most extreme, like the drive-by shooting, that it's an option, but you don't have to use it. Most people don't do that. So in order to cope with it, I think, as the chief indicated, you have to do two things. One is commitment. And if you have commitment that is consistent, then you can build trust in the community. And today, what we're missing most is trust. And without commitment, you don't get trust. And that's why I said it's a long-term effort to do that. And I don't know that you're going to solve it by next Monday or by your next council meeting. Obviously, you won't. But it sort of takes you away from thinking about it. And I would even suggest that in addition to the chief, you should have the other heads of the departments coming to you, and you need to ask them, so who do you partner with to understand what causes crime in the community? Do you know the scope of crime in the community? Do you care about that? And they say, well, it's not part of watershed, or it's not part of parks and recreation, or schools, yeah, maybe later, not now. It's the part and parcel of every service provider in the community to do that.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Chief. Thank you, Dr. Friedman.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. Councilman Wright.
How you doing, Dr. Freeman?
How are you, Councilman?
Great. I'm the chair of this committee, and I'm torn a lot of times with how policing goes forth, not in this city, but throughout our country. And the question that I have for you is the question of law and order. To define law and order is different from one side to the next. So we have law and order, and by any means necessary to shut it down if there's crime. And then there's law and order from the other perspective, to talk about, we want to live in safety, that kind of thing. So it could be extreme when it's law and order. And I just want to make the statement before I give it to you, because I look at systemic racism throughout the country, and also in policing and the history of where policing comes from. So when I talk about this, of course, there are many citizens of all races that may be a little bit confused as to where do we go from here. So when you were talking about, the underlying approaches of the behavioral concepts, also you mentioned focus on the causing condition. And then finally, you said understanding the cause. So when we look at crime overall, and the approach to how we deal with it can be very much misunderstood in our community. So now you have the community not trusting the police, and then the conditions of the police in their training in the past. And where we're trying to go with it is the police may be afraid of a sector of our community, therefore bringing conflict because of not fully understanding either side. So, and I feel real good about the approach that we're taking, and I thank the mayor for putting these committees together. And like the chief said, these questions that we're learning how better to understand policing and what we need to do to make our community safe. So if you can help me to understand, just give me some insight on law and order in your perspectives. And I just want to thank you for being here and with the experience that you have. Can you start with that for me?
Well, thank you, Councilman Wright. I'm honored to be with all of you and share my perspective on community policing. Look, law and order, as you indicated, is a very complicated concept simply by the virtue that law and order are defined differently by different communities. So if you need to anchor it in a specific community, typically what people mean by this is that they can walk in the neighborhood safely and that there isn't violence, looting, burning. That's fairly clear, because under those pretexts in some communities, in Atlanta was one, the National Guard was called in just to try and prevent that. But let me try and give you an example from a different perspective. Let's look at banking for a second. And let's look at law and order in banking. Banking is based on trust. Namely, you deposit a certain amount of money in a bank account, and it's insured by FDIC. So up to a level of, say, 100K, you know that you're not going to lose that money. And that's why you trust that the bank will keep your money better than you can keep it yourself. But if tomorrow, let's say that that bank has 1,000 customers, and all of those customers go in the same day and will withdraw their funds, the bank will collapse. Because the bank operates on the basis of the trust that the citizens or the clients have in the bank. That same relationship applies to the community. So when citizens feel that they are not provided the services that they deserve, or when they have egregious violations for which they protest and they have grievances, some allow themselves to become, let's call it, unruly or go into violent behavior. Oftentimes, that violence is actually harming the same community that it came from. And how do you attenuate it is not an easy issue, because in some places where you used force, it helped. In other places, it only escalated and exacerbated the situation even further. I'm talking about Seattle, for example, where federal law enforcement had to withdraw because it just didn't work. You can achieve far more by conversation and by discussion than by brute force, whether it's coming from the looters or the National Guard. I'll give you an example, and this is probably relevant to the faith-based issue that we discussed earlier. I've taken a delegation of chiefs and sheriffs to Israel, I think this was in 2019, and we went to a city that has a mixed population of Muslims and Jews. And we went to a mosque where we had the imam of the mosque, which is a very famous mosque in the Middle East, very important in the tradition of Islam, and the chief rabbi of the city, and they had a dialogue as two clergy who lead communities that are sometimes in friction, and sometimes they have their own internal problems. And it was absolutely fascinating to see how they were able to work with each other to attenuate the potential friction before it escalates. And who were the forces that brought those two together? The police. That is the epitome of community policing. And there was no shots fired, no guards called in, no violence used. And you look at many of the demonstrations, not only in the United States, you see them in Israel now, you see them in France or in England. And when you have a lot of people unhappy about a given situation, you can't force your way out against everyone. So something is amiss when they don't deal with the issue wisely. You've seen it in quite a lot of movies when you have somebody barricading himself and then the SWAT commander comes and says, I'll take care of it immediately. Well, sometimes you send the police negotiator and they may spend 8 hours, but not a shot will be fired and the person may turn themselves in. Not always, but often. So when you can resolve things without resorting to force, not just to violence, but to force, that's the preferred way of doing it. Because the problem with violence is that if it is seen as having a profit, namely a reward, then more people are going to use it because they want to achieve whatever other people achieved in violence. So in terms of how a specific city deals with it, you don't start dealing with violence when violence erupts. You have to, it's the same way that you don't exchange business cards when you have an emergency. You have to build the trust in the community and you have to build those relationships in the community so that when something starts to be tenuous and it's about the powder keg going to explode, you know who to call, you know who to discuss, you know what to do. And we live in an era, as you well know, where you have flash mobs that could do that on social media within minutes, and you may not have prior intelligence that is even happening. But if you have enough conversation with various segments in the community and you're not stranger to the community, then the likelihood of the lack of law and order is minimized.
Thank you. Very in depth. I really understand that, and I concur. I really like the way that Chief handled situation that recently happened here, gave it time to de-escalate and not just went in to try to shut it down. I think probably would have made it worse. The next question I have, my final question is, we talked about local. You mentioned several times community orientated, local, things of that nature. And so when you talk about trying to deal with behaviors and you discussed poverty versus those that were rich. On both sides, there are crimes, but in our society, we tend to punish those that are poor or those that have the least of these, that have less to get along with, versus the white collar crimes, if you will. So when you talk about societal norms in areas of poverty and homelessness and things of that nature, I think we tend to want to police those areas, police those people more than we police the others. So a part of that, and I hate to keep going back to brown skinned Black people, but when you look at the statistics and the number of people that are criminalized, that are locked up, those people that are in jail now, Black folk, by percentage are overwhelming based upon our population. So help me to understand how we as a community look at that and how do we deal with it? Because I sit on committees that deal with poverty and things of that nature, which you look at the crime rates and things like that in those communities, and it tend to be generational. So in a poor community, the child 18% more likely to grow up in poverty because their parents was in poverty,
Sure.
thereby creating another generation of crime, being locked up, having a felony, which results back into increased crime rates in the community. Talk about that for a moment with us.
Well, you have pointed out a sore historical reality and fact in not only race relations, but in class relationships. And yes, it is much easier for a prosecutor to get somebody on an offense. And if you have a federal policy of 3 strikes and you're out, and you are caught with crack as opposed to powder cocaine, you'll end up with longer prison terms because it's easier to get it. If you are rich and you have a better lawyer, but it's not only as far as crime is concerned. I mean, if rich, you will get a better doctor, and if you are look, if you are a son of a physician, your chances of getting into medical school are higher because the assumption is that you're socialized at home and you'll come with values that, and maybe even some knowledge that will give you an advantage. So what needs to be done is to break that cycle. So improved housing is one, job training is another, assisting parents to teaching parents how to teach kids, having role models in the community. That's partly where Midnight Basketball came in and several other programs. That's not going to change poverty, situations out there. But these are the factors that can break that cycle that, as you indicate, is intra-generational, because it's in one generation, then it's intergeneration because it's moving from generation to generation. And by the way, this is not an American phenomenon. I've done studies on this in Israel. I've seen studies like this in the UK, in Sweden, and in a lot of places. That is a common phenomena of the welfare state. And to break that, you're actually reinforcing the point that I was trying to make. This has nothing to do with what the chief is doing. This has a lot to do with what social services are or are not doing. This has a lot to do with what housing improvement projects will be doing in a community. Because, I mean, everybody wants to live in decent housing. And if you don't allow that to happen, people say, well, it's better for me not to be in an apartment that is run down and has mold and nobody's trying to fix it. And then if you don't have a computer and you cannot do distant learning, you go outside and you start maybe joining a gang because you have acceptance that you don't have at home, and you have role models that work. I mean, the same way that the mafia recruited its soldiers back in the 30s and 40s, and so on and so forth. So the issue really is how to break that. But the point that you make is more than valid. It's a sad reality, and changing that will have much more effect on lowering the crime rate than probably anything else that we can do.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Councilman. Councilmember Kinston.
Thank you, Mayor. Dr. Friedmann, I just had one question that I'm trying to understand, and I waited last to make sure. So what I'm trying to understand is when you mentioned about the crime is the community crime, not the police crime. And so when you talked about the officer's discretion and in police culture and behavior, my question is, with the police culture and behavior, how do you get to the point where you're comfortable with an officer's discretion?
Not only excellent, this is the question of the night when it comes to policing. So thank you for asking it. These are two different issues. One is the crime issue that police need to deal with. And the second issue that you touched upon is how a police officer performs their duty, his or hers. So as long as they are well-trained, well-supervised, they have internalized the values of proper policing, 90 to 95% of the officers in the country, and not only in the United States, do a very decent job. okay? The problem is the bad apples and the culture that sometimes allow those bad apples to perform and not to, to be called on it. If you recall Serpico, that's an example of how you had an internal drug trade and police officers who are corrupt and being paid by the mob, and then they basically help them out and they warn them about raids and so on and so forth. The issue that you began your question with is very different. When I said that the community is the crime producer, take the police out from the equation for a second and just say, okay, you have crime, okay? Who produced that crime? It's a perpetrator. It's somebody who lives in the community. And then you have a pattern. Maybe it's teenagers, because some crimes are mostly, the more younger population you have, the higher the likelihood of juvenile delinquency. Okay, that's an obvious statement. But the police comes to a given product of the community. And that's why I'm trying to move things from just having the police deal with it to have education officials, school officials, health officials, social services officials, and so on, who need to provide services to minimize the likelihood that that crime will happen. So by the same token, that if we have for COVID-19, social distancing, washing hands, sanitizing, and so on and so forth, that's not different for the epidemiology of crime. We need to know who is it, who are the people who commit crimes, okay? And they do have patterns, and any criminologist that you'll utilize to study the patterns in Fayetteville will tell you if it's younger or older, what kinds of crime, what's the relationship between the criminal and the victim, and so on and so forth. Once you know that, that is the way for the police to intervene, but also get other social services to help out. So I make a very clear distinction between the crime that is being produced by the community itself, and then the need to deal with it on one hand, and on the other hand, how a police officer performs when they're either called to an incident or they identify an incident and all of that. I mean, for the life of me, I cannot understand how after May 25th in Minneapolis, when this was a murder that shocked not only the country, but the entire world, there were still police officers who continued to do that. I mean, I just cannot understand it. They don't watch the news, they don't. So there's something wrong in that system, and that needs to be fixed as well. So I'm not suggesting that it is only the community that we need to deal with, but keep in mind, if you look at the statistics that I showed earlier, we're talking about the statistics of violent crime in a community. 99.99% of those crimes are not committed by the police. And in Fayetteville, I'm pretty sure that none of them are committed. And if there is an issue, then they have internal affairs and they have the legal system to deal with it. But the majority of the crimes are committed by community members, not by the police. And it's the same thing about the medical service, the medical profession. None of the illnesses or injuries that bring people to a hospital are produced by the physicians. What the physicians produce is the service to make their lives better. And I think we need to start looking at police in the same way of how did they collect evidence from a rape victim or from a family of a murder victim? Okay, were they courteous to the victims? Did they collect information professionally? They're not botching up the forensic evidence and so on and so forth. This is what police should be assessed and evaluated on, not based on how many crimes, tickets, or arrests they're giving. I hope I wasn't too lengthy with my response.
No, actually, you answered my question. Thank you. I appreciate that.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, Dr. Friedmann, as we certainly appreciate you spending a little time with us. You've given us some insightful information. As we prepare to wrap this up, any recommendations based on what you've been able to gather from looking at our community that you could give to that maybe our police department or the community? Any things that you think we should concentrate on?
Well, first of all, I stand ready to help in any way, and Chief Hawkins knows where I live, so be happy to help. If you'll allow me one way to respond to your question. Notice that your first question was to the chief in terms of to what extent there's a correspondence between what the police department is doing and the framework that I presented. It appears to me that it's important to bring additional partners to this kind of dialogue or questioning, if you will, whether it's in a council meeting or in a cabinet meeting or wherever. I think it's beneficial for any community, but in this case, definitely Fayetteville, to bring in the other partners that up to now are not seen as having quote unquote responsibility for anything other than what they have in their own silos. Namely, we're talking about crime. But you know, if we're talking about COVID-19, then we all know that it's not enough to just have the health profession deal with it. We need to have public health, we need to have social workers, we need to have maybe the police to enforce the regulations and so on and so forth. And I'll give you a specific example from the city of Atlanta. The former police chief, Pennington, we talked about press conferences. And I asked him at one point, when you have a press conference on crime, who's there? And he says, me and the mayor. And I said, and where are the heads of the other police, of the other departments? Where are social services? Where's housing? Where's education? Where's health? Why aren't they on the stage responding to questions? So the one recommendation that I would make, start a dialogue, a discussion to bring in, first of all, the government resources in terms of the services that you provide. And second, to bring in the stakeholders in the community, because without the community, none of this is going to succeed. But because government is more organized in a sense, it's easier to start with the government. And oftentimes it's easier to start with the chief because in this case, she's much more minded than probably anybody else. And I don't want to forget, the community policing movement did not start because of politicians. It did not start because of academics. It started because there were concerned police chiefs who got fed up with the revolving door of somebody who is committing a crime, runs through the justice system, ends up in prison, leaves prison after a while, commits crime, and then back again. And that cycle needs to be changed, because if you don't change that, I mean, we will never live in a community without crime. I mean, just ask Cain about Abel and he'll tell you, okay? So it's as old as humanity. The question is, how much is tolerable? And I don't want to say that, you know, 2 people is better than 20. 2 people killed is 2 people too many. But there's a difference between rates of crime, and I think we need to get to a constant striving of minimizing, particularly the violent crimes, and that's why I use this example. But there are other issues to deal with. So start the dialogue internally in your different departments of the city, then involve the community leaders, then involve the voluntary associations, civic associations, Rotary, Kiwanis. They need to take it as a challenge to help the city with that. I mean, and I think that they would be quite open to that.
Thank you so much, Dr. Friedmann. Thank you, Chief. Thank you, External Committee, Councilman Wright, Councilmember Ingram, for a great idea of having this discussion, and Councilmembers Banks McLaughlin and Councilman Dawkins. So thank you, sir. Look forward to talking to you soon.
Thank you. It was an honor and a privilege to be with you, and I'm ready to assist in any way. I have my associate director, Colonel Brent Cummings, who is an expert in training, and he can help as well if we get to that level. And again, Chief, thank you for the invite, and looking forward to continue to working with all of you.
Thank you, Dr.
Mr. Mayor, I just wanted to give Councilwoman Ingram her kudos because she came up with the idea of bringing Dr. Friedmann on, and the council agreed, the committee, and ended up here before the entire council. So I think it was a great idea.
Yeah, I'm just going to add a little bit as well. You have Prismatica of all cities, right? You have Dr. Friedmann present to us, and Dr. Friedmann, you may not realize, is internationally well-renowned. This is all he studied all his life. So thank you, Dr. Friedmann. I appreciate
So
it.
we're a big
Thank you,
deal
Chief.
now.
You, hello, I keep trying to tell you, we're a
Thank you,
big
sir.
deal.
Can we get a motion to adjourn? Thank you, Chief.